Rose, thank you very much for your words of introduction. Just another little bit of housekeeping, if we may. If during the course of the presentations, any questions come to you, please put them into the chat facility on the Zoom call, and then we'll come to them in due time. Just type any questions you have into the chat facility. As Rose has mentioned, I'm Bishop Richard Moth, the Bishop of Arundel and Brighton Diocese, and also the Liaison Bishop for Prisons for the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. And I'm delighted to be with you this evening. Thank you for inviting me to chair the event. Let's just begin with a moment of prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus Christ, you who have come that we may have life to the full, listen to our prayers for all those in prison. Touched by your Spirit, may they find newness of heart and be open to that new life that is found only in you. May they know the care and support of all around them, finding new purpose in serving you in their brothers and sisters, to your greater glory, you who live and reign forever and ever. Amen. Our Lady of Mercy, pray for us. Saint Maximilian Kolbe, pray for us.
Pray for us.
And Saint Teresa of Avila, whose feast day it is today, pray for us. So, just to introduce very briefly our two speakers this evening, Emily Evison from the Prison Reform Trust, who is going to open the batting and speak to us first, and she'll be followed by Julia Corcoran from the Prison Advice and Care Trust. Julia has just been sorting out some technical difficulties at her end, but I'm sure she'll be back in a minute. So, oh, there she is. There we are. Greetings, Julia. So, Emily, without further ado, over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Great, thank you so much. I am just going to share my screen with you. So bear with me one moment. Right, can everyone see those slides okay? Yep, see, I'm seeing some nods. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Emily and I am the policy lead for women at the Prison Reform Trust. And I'm going to give you a bit of an overview today of the landscape of women's imprisonment across England and Wales and why we, PRT, have argued for the need to reset the approach to women's imprisonment. And I'll also talk about a few kind of key policy developments that there has been. So, I work for the Prison Reform Trust, and some of you may have heard of us before, but we are an independent UK-wide charity looking to create a just, humane and effective penal system. So we do this by inquiring into the workings of the system, informing prisoners, staff and the wider public, and influencing Parliament, government and officials towards reform. Our main objectives are reducing the unnecessary imprisonment and promoting community solutions to crime, improving treatment and conditions for prisoners and their families, and promoting equality and human rights in the criminal justice system. We also have an advice and information service who support prisoners. So, the number of women in prison has remained stubbornly high, despite calls for reform and sort of widespread cross-party agreement that the majority of women in prison don't need to be there, which I'll talk more on later. So from this graph, you can hopefully see, which goes up to January this year, there are more than double the number of women in prison as there were 30 years ago. There's a slight drop over the COVID pandemic time, but we're increasingly seeing the numbers increase to kind of pre-pandemic levels. So the current landscape of women in prison in England and Wales is characterised by short sentences, often for non-violent offences, high rates of mental ill health, disrupted family connections, and resettlement challenges. So as of Monday, 13th of October, there were 89,256 people in prison in England and Wales. And the vast majority of those people in prison are men, with women only accounting for 4% of the total prison population. So of that 89,256 total number, 3,516 of them were women. Now, this is a snapshot figure, so e.g. how many people were in prison on one day, but because of the nature of the women's population, which I'll talk about a bit more later, the flow figure, which is how many women are in prison over a year, is much higher. So women were sentenced to prison on 5,738 occasions in 2024. There are also only 12 women's prisons across England and Wales, but actually none of them are in Wales. And the prisons for women are spread across the country, often in the middle of nowhere, making it difficult to get public transport there. This means women are often held considerable distances from home. The average we know is around 63 miles, but many will be held considerably further, often over 100 miles. This means that organising visits and maintaining family contact can be difficult during their sentence, and that's without considering how expensive the journey is likely to be. So often women's offending is different to men's. Now, these aren't quite the most up-to-date figures, but unfortunately I didn't have the snazzy graphs for the most up-to-date figures. So I wanted to show you these, which were taken from our Resetting the Approach to Women's Imprisonment briefing, and it's unlikely that the new figures have changed the landscape too much. So women tend to commit less serious offences than men. For example, theft from shops was the most frequent offence for which women went to a prison, accounting for 26% of all women's prison sentences, compared to 15% of men's. In 2023, more women were sent to prison to serve a sentence for theft than criminal damage, arson, drug offences, possession of weapons, robbery, and sexual offences combined. So I'll just repeat that. More women were sent to prison on a sentence of theft than for criminal damage and arson, drug offences, possession of weapons, robbery, and sexual offences combined. You can also see from the slide that women are more likely to be serving short sentences. So 50% of sentences given to women were for less than 6 months. And this is really disappointing given how harmful short prison sentences can be. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. So for many women, their first experience of prison will be on remand. And this is when a person has been charged and may either be ahead of their trial or whilst they await their sentencing, having been found guilty. It also means they have not yet been convicted of the offence. So in 2023, the Justice Select Committee, which is a cross-party group of MPs who scrutinise sort of policies and administration of the Ministry of Justice, raised serious concerns about the number of people being remanded to custody and the length of time that people were being held on remand because of court capacity constraints. The committee urged for use of alternatives, so for example, like conditional bail, which could include the person being allowed to go home but having to adhere to certain conditions set by the court, so things like curfews, and for more community of support to avoid the use of remand. But now in 2025, numbers remain high, and across the whole prison population, not just for women, remand is at its highest level in 50 years. So people on remand currently make up almost 1 in 5 of the total prison population, which is over 17,000 people. And we know that the majority of women are sentenced to short sentences for non-violent crimes, and so the extent to which they're remanded to prison is particularly concerning, especially because they will often be acquitted or instead receive a community sentence. So as you can see from the slide, in 2023 at the magistrates' courts, 3,622 women were remanded to custody, and only 15% of those were eventually given an immediate custodial sentence. It was slightly higher in the Crown Court, with 54% eventually receiving an immediate custodial sentence. And for women who often feel the pains of imprisonment more acutely, remand can be particularly damaging. In 2023, 26% of self-harm incidents by women in prison were by those held on remand. So the other side of the coin is the number of women recalled to prison. So recall is the process of returning a person to custody after they've been released from custody on a license. And recall can happen because of a further offence, but it can also happen because the person might have breached their licence conditions. And the growing use of recall in England and Wales is particularly affecting people serving short sentences of less than 12 months. And for women, we know that for those serving sentences of less than 12 months accounted for more than half of all recalls. And a recall can be triggered for more than one reason. However, in the majority of cases, recalls are for non-compliance rather than for suspected reoffending. So for women, of all recalls last year, only 18% of them involved a further charge. And women from ethnic minority groups are overrepresented at every stage of the criminal justice system. Research has found that they often face a double disadvantage of being discriminated against because of their gender and their race. In England and Wales, 16% of the sentenced women's prison population are recorded as Asian or Asian British, Black or Black British, mixed or other ethnic group, and this is the terminology that the Ministry of Justice uses. But this increases to 20% of those remanded in the women's prison population. So I'm going to talk a bit about pregnancy mothers in prison and their children. So after tireless campaigning from advocates and organisations, it's now widely recognised that all pregnancies in prison are high risk. Pregnant women in prison are 7 times more likely to suffer stillbirth. Over the whole of the last year, there were 215 pregnant women held in prison, and figures actually show that being pregnant and in prison is becoming more common. So there were 21 more pregnant women in prison than the previous year, with an average of 47 imprisoned at any one time. 53 babies were born in prison in 2023 to 2024, compared to 44 the previous year. And His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service does not record how many people experience miscarriage in prison. Now, 6 of the 12 women's prisons have mother and baby units, MBUs, and these are units which women have to apply to. And if they're successful, they are allowed to stay with their babies until the child is 18 months old. And in 2021, the Prison Service published a new policy framework on pregnancy, mother and baby units, and maternal separation in women's prisons, which set out additional requirements to meet the needs of women and their babies in prison. We also know that women are more likely to be primary carers than their male counterparts. Ministry of Justice data estimates that over half of women in prison have a child under 18 years old. Research estimates that in 2020, more than 17,500 children were separated from their mother by imprisonment. Overall, when a mother is imprisoned, around 9% of children are cared for by their father, compared to nearly 3/4 of children who continue to live with their mother when their father is imprisoned. And parental imprisonment can double the risk in children of poor mental health and place them at greater risk of poverty, poor health, and insecure housing. So women in prison are also more likely to suffer with mental ill health. More than 3 in 5 report mental health problems, compared to just over half of men. Women are also more likely than men to self-harm whilst in prison. And many women in prison are severely mentally unwell. In 2022, women accounted for 13% of transfers from prison to secure mental health facilities, despite making up only 4% of the population. And we see that women and men who are acutely mentally unwell are still sent to prison as a place of safety, which is particularly worrying because prison isn't and shouldn't ever be considered a place of safety. So for women serving short sentences, which I've covered is the vast majority of women in prison, their resettlement outcomes on release are often worse. So 44% of women leaving prison are reconvicted within a year. And this is hardly surprising given how harmful short sentences can be. So these short sentences are long enough to lose all the anchors that women might have in the community. So her job, her home, her child caring responsibilities. but not long enough in prison to engage in any meaningful interventions which address the often complex and unmet needs surrounding the offending behaviour. And women released from prison are more likely to reoffend and reoffend sooner than those serving community sentences. We know that less than half of women left prison in the last year with settled accommodation. Many didn't have a job. Only 10% of women were in employment 6 weeks after release, compared to 20% of men. And if you don't have a home on release, then, it's a really terrible place to start. Women are also held further away from home, as I said before, on average 63 miles. So family support on release is vital, but being held further from home makes keeping in touch with that family during their sentence harder, and so then harder on release. So we have been talking about the need to do something different for women in prison for a very long time. In 2007, Baroness Corcoran completed a review of vulnerable women in the criminal justice system. The review made 43 recommendations about the treatment of women in the criminal justice system and argued for the need for a distinct, radically different, visibly led, woman-centred approach. It also recognised that a large proportion of the women in the criminal justice system are mothers, and recommended that children are taken into account by the criminal justice system. But as you will have probably guessed from my previous slides, unfortunately, Corcoran's recommendations have not been implemented to the extent that we would have hoped. Most recently, in September last year, the government announced a commitment to establishing a Women's Justice Board to reduce the number of women in custody by using early intervention and tackling the root causes of offending. It was a really welcomed announcement, and everybody in the sector was very positive. And the plan was to bring senior leaders in the criminal justice system, charities and government departments together to publish a new strategy in the spring. Unfortunately, the strategy has been delayed and we're still waiting it, so we have to watch this space to see what it will look like. So what might the answer be? And we think that it lies in a multi-pronged approach. So an effective response to women with multiple needs requires government departments and professional services to integrate systems and support around the individual. So this could look like what we call a whole system approach. And a whole system approach for women in the criminal justice system assesses her needs and provides gender-specific multi-agency support. And there are good examples of whole system approaches in England and Wales already, such as Greater Manchester and London and West Midlands, where there have been concerted efforts to develop more effective responses to women's offending. And that lies in collaborative work between police, courts, women's services across health, social care and voluntary sectors. So building upon these examples would help to ensure women in England and Wales benefit from the joined up provision. We also need to look at early intervention and diversion. So intervening earlier and diverting women away from the criminal justice system. Again, there are examples of good practice which exist, but they need to be developed further. So we have out-of-court disposals, and these are police-led methods for resolving lower-level offences before they get to the court process. And they can offer an immediate and proportionate response to women's offending. So, for example, the simple caution, which is a type of out-of-court disposal, has had a positive record in reducing reoffending, but the proportion of women dealt with by out-of-court disposals is small and decreasing. So in 2013, 35,737 cautions were given to women, compared to only 8,969 in 2023, which is a 75% decrease over 10 years. We also have pre-sentence reports, and these are a detailed report prepared by the probation officer to help the court determine the most appropriate sentence for a person. And they're a key part of the court process and give the sentencer a fuller picture of the person being sentenced. So, for example, with a woman, do they have any caring responsibilities? Courts are over 10 times more likely to impose a community sentence if a pre-sentence report is conducted. And the decline in the use of pre-sentence reports is closely linked to the sharp fall in the number of community sentences. So, but the quality of these reports is key. So detailed reports, the standard reports, have fallen by 88% in the last 10 years. And unfortunately, reports compiled hurriedly on the day are unlikely to include all of the relevant information that the sentencer needs. And research by HM Inspectorate of Probation found that less than half of all inspected court reports were sufficiently analytical and personalised to the individual to inform the court's decision making. So we've still got a way to go. Now, I've talked quite a lot about community sentences through the presentation, and an incredibly important part of this multi-pronged approach is looking to community solutions to reduce the number of women in prison. So a community sentence is a punishment which involves requirements carried out in the community rather than in prison. So it could include things like unpaid work, having a curfew, or perhaps undergoing alcohol or drug treatment programs, and it's tailored to the individual who's receiving the sentence. Now, unfortunately, the use of community sentences for women has reduced by almost 2/3 since 2010. And when you look at this comparison on the graph compared to short prison sentences and suspended sentences, you can see that they've been a lot more stable over that time. So community solutions are key in reducing the number of women in prison. As I've touched on, unlike imprisonment, they allow for maintenance of family ties, jobs, childcare responsibilities, and housing, each of which are factors which help reduce the risk of reoffending. Community sentences can also help to address the underlying factors that led to the offending and repair some of the harms caused by it. And we know that the Ministry of Justice's own evidence shows that reconviction rates are lower for people on community orders than short sentences. And the positive impact of that is even more marked for people with mental ill health. And as I've listed here, women's centres are a huge part of that. They play a vital role in reducing reoffending and by co-locating a range of health, social care, justice services, probation in a non-stigmatizing, supportive environment. And they can be especially beneficial for the delivery of community sentence treatment requirements or drug and alcohol requirements. And the economic argument for the support of women's centres demonstrates the cost per woman. So for women's centres, the cost per woman ranges from around £1,000 to around £4,000, depending on the need, while a place in a prison costs around £50,000. So you can see the difference there. But unfortunately, investment in women's centres is often short-term, inconsistent and inadequate, which has led to a lot of women's centres being closed over the last, well, since COVID, really. So what now? I've sort of, like I say, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour going through that, but I hope I've kind of talked through the fact that despite widespread agreement on the need for reform and some good groundwork in terms of policies and interventions, implementation of the solutions across England and Wales has been slow and inconsistent. And political discourse and media narratives and a prison overcrowding crisis, which is currently hitting the whole of the prison estate, means that women are still often lost in a system primarily designed for men, where addressing the problems of the male imprisonment still dominates. So moving beyond this status quo requires bold and creative solutions alongside sustained development and implementation of the pre-existing good practice that we know about. We have a lot of the solutions already, but we need consistent implementation and funding of these. And we do hope that the new Women's Justice Board and other things that the current government is introducing, such as the sentencing bill, will help to move some of this policy finally forward to practice. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now. I think we're passing straight on to next.
Almost. Emily, thank you very much for a really informative, as you said, quite a lot of information there. Lots for us to think about. And Perhaps questions are beginning to come into the question box, but we'll come to those later. So thank you so much.
Thank
We're going to hand over now to Julia. There is Julia from PACT.
Thank you, Bishop Richard. Hopefully, my slides are now on show for you. So I'm Julia from PACT, as Bishop Richard mentioned. I'm the head of Faith in Action, which means it's my job to engage with our Catholic and wider Christian community. So PACT is the Prison Advice and Care Trust, the leading national Catholic charity, and we work to support prisoners and their families in England and Wales. So we provide caring and life-changing services at every stage of the justice process, in court, in prison, on release, and in the community. So we're here for people of all faiths and none, but our Catholic values influence the way we work, which include respecting human dignity, walking with love and care alongside prisoners and their families, and believing that everyone can be redeemed and make a fresh start, which is also the name of our quarterly newsletter. So if you're interested at the end, do let me know and I can sign you up for that. So a key part of our work is to help men and women in prison to grow and maintain strong relationships with their families, as well as supporting with their health and well-being. We also provide emotional and practical support to children and families affected by imprisonment. So for children, having mum or dad in prison is an experience which can affect their whole lives. And we also support prisoners who have limited or no social contact. And this service is proven to reduce the risk of self-harm, violence, and disruptive behaviour, and the risk of reoffending, which Emily very helpfully talked us through earlier. And so we work in over 68 prisons running the visitor centres, including 9 out of the 12 women's prisons. And we have staff and volunteers supporting the families and children as they visit their loved ones in prison. And so the reason we do this is originally at the beginning of our journey in 1898, we know that, and we have the records and we have them in the archive of Bishop Richard kindly host them for us. And we have the very first meeting that was started by Canon John Gooney, an Irish Catholic priest, and he met and set up the Catholic Prison Aid Society. And the story in the book is that they were set up to support a young child who was called Roots. So we always talk about how Roots started our roots. And what we don't know much about this young child, apart from that she was orphaned by the criminal justice system. But we do know where she went on to, so therefore we know she is a she. And so that was the very start of our journey, and we continue to do that as we continue doing our work now. So our mission is to support prisoners and their families in order to make a fresh start, and also to minimise the harm that's caused by imprisonment on people with convictions, families, and their communities. Now, I have a stats slide. Some of this is a repeat of what Emily said, but I thought it was just a helpful sharing of the picture of the need of people in prison. So we know that in the general population, the people who have an experience of care is 2%, but for women in prison, that is 31% of the population. We also know for people who have no qualifications in prison as overall, so men and women, that's 47% compared to 15% in general population. We also know the experience of the people in prison who've experienced abuse as a child. For women, that's as high as 53%, 27% for men, but it's only 20% in the general population. So as you can start to see, some of these things have a higher proportion for women than compared to both men and the general population, including observed violence in the home as a child, that's 41%, and also have attempted suicide at some point is as high as 46% in the prison population versus 6% in the general population. So, as I've already mentioned, PACT works in 9 out of the 12 women's prisons. And so we do this by many different ways, and some of this we do specifically in the women's prisons, and some of this we do in every prison. So that we work in. So the first is our family engagement services, which I've already kind of talked about, but it's our work that we do with people as they come to visit their loved ones in prison. And so we support them as they go through that process, and we also we support them inside the prison as well. So one of my favorite things is that we offer play areas for young children as they come to visit mum or dad in prison. And I think it's also worth highlighting that one of the works we do in the male prisons is supporting mums, and as Emily mentioned earlier, quite often it is mum who's looking after the children when their dad is in prison, to make sure that they themselves stay out of trouble so that they're not influenced into trying to bring something into prison as well. So that's part of the work, even if it's not necessarily the key part of our work as well. And so then other things that we offer include prison-based social workers, which I'm going to talk a bit more about, and also family and relationship courses. So these are commissioned by the prisons, and they're courses that women can do in order to help support them to build their relationship up with their children or other members of their family. And then we have support for women and their children, which I'm also going to speak about a particular project called Visiting Mum. And then we have our resettlement workers. And so these lead and deliver services that ensure prisoners and their families have access to appropriate advice, guidance, and support. So it also allows for women to be linked back into their communities after they are released as well. So the first scheme I want to talk to you about is Visiting Mums scheme. So I think Emily mentioned that all of the women's prisons are in England. We don't have any women's prisons in Wales, which can often mean that women are, and mothers particularly, are further away from home than they would like to be. So we currently operate 2 visiting mum services. So the first is supporting Welsh mothers of, in particular in HMP Style and Eastwood Park, and one supports women HMP Downview. So visiting mum is based on what was a successful 3-year pilot, and it was run in partnership as a trial for between 2014 and 2017. And so the evaluation of this by Cardiff University showed that the work reduces the risk of self-harm and promotes positive health and well-being among mothers, who also are improving long-term outcomes for their children. So Visiting Mum, as it says on the screen, identifies women who are at risk of losing control with their children and offers specialist support to persevere and strengthen those vital family ties. So mothers are invited to engage in parenting and relationship programs to receive the one-to-one support from our team. But it also is about supporting the children and their families as well. So we have specially trained volunteers providing emotional support to the women's children and families in the community and prepare them to visit their loved ones in prison. They're also able to offer practical support, including providing transport and accompanying children and their families to prison visits, which I'm sure is a daunting experience for anyone, but particularly for a young child. So these services is invaluable for the many Welsh mothers who, as I've already mentioned, are imprisoned in England and who can struggle to maintain their right to contact because of practical considerations such as the cost of travel or the lack of suitable adult supervision. So the other services that I want to talk about is our prison-based social workers. So their role is to bridge the gap between the prison and the social services in the community, keeping mothers in touch with their children, which is in the child's best interest. Sorry, I should say where it is in the child's best interest. The social workers offer intensive one-to-one support for women, empowering them to engage in matters involving their child, speaking for themselves at court, and to understand the process and how to work with them. They also provide a vital link with community social workers who have children of female prisoners on their caseload, but who may be reluctant to encourage family visits or contact. And so this project came about from Lord Farmer's landmark review in 2019 about the importance of maintaining family ties in women's prisons. And the report recommended that the Ministry of Justice fund on-site social workers as part of the work within each prison. There is currently no structure in place for children whose mothers are in custody, and children whose mothers are in prison face hardship and challenges that severely limit their ability to reach their full potential. And we also know maternal separation can cause long-lasting trauma for both mothers and the children. So and this is a really key statistic for PACT, which is that people in prisons who maintain family ties are 39% less likely to reoffend, which is a big reason why we do the work that we do. So evaluations of this project show that the PACT social workers support more frequent and positive contact between mothers and children, dealing with dozens of local authorities across England and Wales. It's also promoted mothers' rights and gives them a say in key decisions, and instills hope in women to remain positive and play a significant role in managing self-harm and the risk of suicide among women in prison. And it brings new specialist knowledge of safeguarding and social services processes, which does not just benefit the women in prison, but also helps to upskill other prison staff. So that's our prison-based social workers. And as I said, it was in an initial trial, and it's slowly we're growing it now to increase the amount of prison-based social work. So at the beginning, there was just 2, but we're hoping to expand that as well. And then the other thing that I want to mention is the Picking Up Pieces, which is an ecumenical report that was released in July. So PACT convened this, and it brought Christian leaders together, including Bishop Rachel, who's the liaison bishop in the Anglican Church, and also Bishop Richard Moth. So it was an ecumenical approach to criminal justice reform, and it makes recommendations for reform based on the Christian Church's shared values, knowledge, and experience of delivering services that makes a difference in people's lives. So at the centre of these is a call to place victims and survivors at the heart of the criminal justice process. However, in order to fulfill the ambition of the recent independent sentencing review, we felt there was need for the government to focus urgently on at least 3 key areas. So the first of these areas, which won't surprise you from what I've been saying, is about supporting prisoners' children and their families. So there is an estimate that there are about 200,000 children each year who will have a parent in prison, and that's likely to be an underestimate. And so one of the things that PACT in particular is calling for is the identification of children, not so that they can then be shunned for the fact that their parent is in prison, but more so that at least one person in their lives is aware of the situation that's going on for them so that they can offer support. Because we hear of stories, we run the HMPPS's prisoners' families helpline, and we hear of stories of a mum who's been told by her solicitor that she shouldn't be expecting a custodial sentence. She'll be getting a community or a suspended sentence. But then she goes to court and she ends up with that custodial sentence, and suddenly she doesn't have a way to contact the school or anyone to go to pick up her children, and suddenly the school are left in a situation unaware of what's going on, and these children are left at the school gates. So we think it's really important that children have at least one person who knows what's going on in their life as well. Our second key area of this report is investing in restorative justice. So we are fully aware that victims' needs are routinely ignored by the criminal justice system, despite pledges from government for all political persuasions. However, we believe that pitting victims against offenders is a zero-sum equation, which ignores 2 key factors. Firstly, that many victims are primarily concerned with preventing reoffending so that others are not victimized. And secondly, that offenders are disproportionately likely to be victims themselves. And we know this is particularly true in the women estates. So we urge the government in this report to invest in a wider rollout of restorative justice, and it meets the need of the victims and survivors, people with convictions, and wider society, as so many who participate to go on to lead good lives while contributing to their local communities. Restorative justice is both much cheaper than prison and probation services, and its effectiveness is underpinned by strong evidence. And then the third key recommendation of the report is about empowering churches and faith communities and Christian organizations to continue providing vital, life-changing services. So in the report, we lay out 4 Christian organisations that work in different ways through the criminal justice system. So from prevention, working with victims and survivors, working in prisons, which probably won't surprise you to hear is the example is PACT, and on release. We also know that there are hundreds more from all faiths that we could have highlighted. So we're recommending a grant scheme to support these projects. What we want to do is have the greatest impact on reducing reoffending and making our communities safer for everyone, and in particular supporting women who have very different needs to men, as Emily mentioned before. So from that, there's the kind of question of how can you support women in prison? Well, for PACT, we would encourage people to volunteer. As we said, we work in 9 out of the 12, and so we're often looking for volunteers. As was mentioned by Rose at the beginning, it was just Prisoner Sunday. This is Prisons Week, so we would encourage you to pray. And there's also the opportunity of coming up at Christmas of Operation Elf, which is where you can link with a particular prison and provide gifts. And if you're interested, it can be specifically for the women estates, so that mum can to have the opportunity to give her child a gift at Christmas time and still be able to build that relationship with her child or children. And thank you. And I think I'm passing back to Bishop Richard.
Julia, thank you. Ooh. All right, there we go. Julia, thank you very much indeed. It's again been very informative, and a little tour there of the great work being done by PACT across our prison estate. Now, my understanding is that we're going to have the opportunity now to go into little breakout rooms for some
Relation in it being smaller, what that means in practice is often women's prisons are trying to do more things, they're having to fulfill more roles. So for example, HMP Bronzefield, which is the largest women's prison, that is a prison which receives women from court. It has women on really short sentences, but it also has women on incredibly long sentences, which means the prison is trying to do many things. And I think that does affect women's ability to progress and their resettlement opportunities, especially when prisons are overcrowded. So, and I know we've done some work in Prison Reform Trust with women serving really long sentences, and we've definitely heard from them that it can be really challenging being in a space where they're very early on in a long sentence, being in, next to someone who's serving maybe a month, maybe 2 months, and kind of navigating that as well as part of the process, seeing people kind of coming and going a lot, can be really difficult for them. So yeah, that's what I would say for that.
Thank you very much indeed. Our next question that's popped up, I'll just read these out so we know. What is the impact of the sentencing bill likely to be on women? If short sentences are scrapped, will women be sentenced for longer, or will there be investment in making community sentences more effective? Just if I may offer the thought that the scrapping of the 6-month sentence doesn't necessarily mean that 6-month sentences will become 8-month sentences just so that people can go to prison. That I don't think is the government's intention. But if Emily, you'd like to offer a reflection on that would be good.
I mean, I think that's correct. The proposed presumption to suspend prison sentences of less than 12 months is the provision that's going to have a real effect on women. And we hope in practice that will mean far less women are going to prison. They are instead having community sentences. But how that works on the ground, the devil is in the detail. And part of it would need to be checking that on the ground, like you say, there isn't sentence inflation and people are not getting given longer sentences because of wanting for imprisonment. But more broadly, what's really important with the provision is that if there are less short prison sentences, as you say, there needs to be that investment in community services, so there can be that wraparound support, because that's what we know women need to rehabilitate, and having those kind of community sentences which are really tailored to the individual, which is quite difficult because we know that the probation service is completely overstretched as it is. So there needs to be some serious investment on a policy level as well as a legislative level if that provision is going to have the effect that we all want it to have.
Thank you. Julia, do you have any reflections on that same theme? Is Julia gone?
I'm still here. I'm just having issues with my laptop on Zoom, so I've just joined on my phone. As I've only heard partly of what Emily said, but I think from what I gathered, she said that about people who are longer term in have longer term custodial sentences really struggle when the change of the prison happens with people with shorter sentences. And I've heard that a lot from both our members of staff and our Catholic chaplains, that it can be a real struggle when the whole ethos of the prison seems to change constantly because of new people coming in and new people coming out, and it doesn't add that consistency to people who've got longer sentences as well.
Thank you. There's a question about whether the recording is going to be made available. That's a bit beyond my pay grade, but the answer is yes. Now, relating to the probation service, here's a question as to whether probation officers are now in a privately provided system, whereas once they were state licensed and inspected. HMPPS, which oversees probation and prisons, is His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. I think perhaps that answers that, is that it is still state licensed and still inspected. While we do have privately run and owned prisons, which are brought into the system, and those who receive some who receive sentences are sent to privately owned and run prisons. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any private probation services. Others may know different.
That is correct. So the probation service was reunified, and I think around 2021 back to a publicly owned probation service, and it is inspected by HM Inspectorate of Probation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is certainly the case, as with the prison system, that it's very overstretched and really struggles to fulfill all that's required of it. But yes, it is licensed and inspected. Excuse me. A question here about those with learning disabilities as well as mental health problems in prison. I would just like, if I may, and then I'll open it up to Emily and Julia, but just add in a thought here, and this is from a report with which I was involved probably 14 odd years ago now, on the particular mental health needs of the traveller community in prisons, because there are particular concerns there arising from perhaps often a lack of literacy, and the fact that their whole lifestyle doesn't cope with being cooped up for obvious reasons. So looking at the learning disability, mental health piece, Julia, Emily, would you like to comment on either of those a little further? Start with Julia this time.
I would say that's firstly not an area that I'm an expert in, but I remember visiting a prison and being told that quite often in this was the Catholic chaplain was telling me that quite often those who were coming to the service would pick up the books but would have them upside down because they didn't want to admit that they couldn't read, but so that they would hold it to look like they did, but they couldn't read it, so they didn't realize it was upside down. And I remember that particular chaplain talking to me about that being a real challenge. And I don't know what's going on with the screen right now, which has kind of distracted me, but and that being like a particular challenge and something that they were trying to work on to support people as well. But I do know in our work at PACT, we also work on a scheme called listening listening with families, which is about families who have experience of obviously their loved one being able to share with the prison service about what they might need, in particular in the healthcare, but also in learning difficulties as well. And so, yeah, I know that's an area of work that we are exploring, but I'll pass over to Emily in case she has more words of wisdom for that as well.
Emily.
Yes, yeah, it's also not an area we do lots at the moment on. We had a previous colleague of ours, Jenny Talbot, who did a lot of work on the area of learning disability in prison. So I would recommend going to the Prison Reform Trust website and having a look at some of the briefings that she's done there. I do know that I think people with learning disabilities or who are neurodiverse are overrepresented in the prison population, but I know also that kind of trying to get data and statistics on that to be able to advocate is really quite difficult. It's not very well recorded or routinely held, so that makes life a little bit more tricky.
I mean, if I could just offer a personal experience here. This concerns the men's estate, but some while ago in one of our prisons, I was asked to baptize a chap who'd come to faith while in prison and had quite severe learning difficulties. We brought the date of his baptism forward because he was due for release. I was back in the prison within about 3 months. He was already back. And the simple reason was that because of the many challenges he had, one of them being his learning difficulties, he just went straight back out to where he'd been before he came in, and was back in very, very quickly. He just didn't, for all sorts of reasons, didn't have the kind of capacity really to move on, and the support just wasn't there. And that there will be, I'm sure, and any chaplains on this call, there are 1 or 2 I know this evening, any chaplains here will know of that experience. Just while we're on the theme of people, what happens to people when they leave the custodial sentence, how can we ensure that those on short-term sentences can be given accommodation when they are released, rather than given a sleeping bag and sometimes a tent? So accommodation, Emily, can you say a word on the accommodation side of things for us?
Yeah, so I think it's a real issue for women, and we did a briefing. It was before COVID now, but we did find out that women were being released with tents, which is just absolutely awful. I think for women, the accommodation needs that they have, it needs to be suitable, stable, gender specific accommodation, which makes it harder. The way the accommodation services within prison work has been changed more recently, which means that though they have accommodation leads in each prison, they are trying to find accommodation for a very broad area because there are so few women's prisons. So a lot of women, in London may not necessarily be resettling to London. They may be resettling to much further afield, which makes things more difficult. There is a duty to refer in the Homeless Reduction Act, so there should be a duty for referral, but often women are considered and men are considered intentionally homeless from having been in prison. So that's probably more on what's going wrong and what we can do to ensure it. But really, it needs to be all the different services involved that need to support women into safe, stable, secure housing need to be involved in an earlier stage, and it needs to be a priority so that can be in place ready for the woman to leave prison, and that's unfortunately not the case very often.
And just allied to that, someone has asked the question, is there anything done to prevent women losing their home while in prison? And I'd ask both of you to comment on this, because I'm conscious of the work that PACT has been doing on the needs of families and young people in particular. So let's start with Julia there, and then we'll come to Emily.
Well, I was just thinking as Emily was answering the question of somebody I met in a prison who she was in a situation where she had lost her family home because her partner had taken care of her child. And so that was one of the challenges when she was leaving about where she was going to go next. And so for our work, it's about supporting women and men as they come out of prison to build those relationships when appropriate with their family members so that there is a home for them to go to, whether that's with their children or with their partner or with the extended family as well.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to add anything there?
I don't think I have lots to add specifically. I think it's often whether the woman is able to keep her home depends on the type of housing she had beforehand, the length of the sentence that she's on. So it's possibly more of an individual case by case basis, but I unfortunately don't know in more detail than that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Now, a couple of interesting questions here. Is there any evidence that women still get prison sentences because of an old prejudice that as the upholders of the morals of society, when they offend, it's a greater offence than men offending? I'm not sure myself that that would be the case, but Emily or Julia may have a thought on that.
I think we do still hear of times where women have been sentenced to prison to be made an example of, and that has been said in the remarks to them. Again, that is on a case by case basis, so I wouldn't want to make sweeping generalizations on that. But I believe, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but I believe that women are more likely to get a prison sentence for their first offence than their male counterparts. So I would say to an extent that is probably still alive and well in the system. Like I said, it's very difficult to say quite how much, but we do hear of it.
So can I just, if you don't mind, stay on that one? One of the things that came up in our little chat group was the number of offences involving shoplifting was noted. And I think we were all pretty sure that that could very well be related to poverty, women trying to look after their children, perhaps when they were being either neglected by their partner or they were single parent mums. What you've just said there suggests that they might end up in prison more quickly than a man might for shoplifting offences, rather than having had several warnings, fines, etc., before we get to prison. Would that be the case?
It possibly could be. I don't know, Julia, if you know more specifically, but I was crunching some figures recently, and I do know that from the latest figures, theft from shops for women was the top offence for which women were imprisoned by a country mile compared to the next highest offence type.
Julia, anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to just add two things really. One, that I don't know that statistic if it's definitely true today, but I remember when I first started volunteering in prisons work, which was a good 10 years ago, there was reports coming out then that was true, that women were more likely to receive a custodial sentence than a man would, on the basis that, as somebody said in the chat, it was seen as to be a shocking thing, and it would stop the reoffending, which actually often proves to be untrue. And then the other thing I was going to say is I was recently talking to someone who isn't from PACT, but does volunteer with people in courts and supports them when they have. And they were saying that a couple of times they felt they've needed to challenge judges when they've made that, when they've said something about a woman getting a sentence because she's a woman. And so I think might not be a sweeping statement across the whole board, but it's definitely still out there.
All right, thank you. There are one or two sort of observations here rather than questions. One from a solicitor who's had criminal clients, makes the comment that magistrates do often have a particular attitude, especially to women, thinking a sharp shock will punish and prevent reoffending. So there's a comment there. And also the recognition that homelessness can encourage women to sofa surf or to go onto the street, something that certainly I think many of us would be aware of that. And the observation made that the number to which Emily referred in her paper, the number of black women in prison is disproportionate. Just coming back to one or two questions here. Does the women's estate still have a requirement for level 2 English and maths in education?
I don't think so, but I don't know if you know specifically, Julia. I know there's been a lot of stuff in the news recently about prison education budgets being cut. The Inspectorate of Prisons did a thematic that came out last week to say that education in prisons was pretty dire, and that we know budgets are being cut. But so I don't think that's a requirement, but I'm not 100% on that.
No, I myself had a meeting with the Inspector of Prisons a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the education budgets being cut, and I've certainly come across people finding it more difficult to access education in prisons over the last few years than perhaps before. Is there, and we've asked that, we've had that one. Now, a couple of sort of practical questions about where we kind of what our response is to this. One question is, are there women-specific housing charities?
Yes, there is Housing for Women.
Yeah.
And within some of the housing charities, there will be women-specific provision. There is also an organisation called Safer Homes for Women Leaving Prison. It's an initiative, sorry, who are more of an advocacy initiative rather than charities providing the housing themselves.
Thank you, Emily. Julia, anything to add on that front?
No.
Okay. No, hang on, there's another little one down here. Right, I'll come to that one in a moment. And then the other question here is, how can we in our parishes help? Shall I have a go at that one myself? Let's have
I'm
a
happy
try.
to jump in if you would like me
Please
to.
do, but I think we need to look at this from both ends. So if we from both, yeah, but I'll put it in those terms. Coming back to the example of shoplifting that's come up this evening, parish communities need always to do what they can to support those who are struggling. And I think there's obviously parishes can always do more to support those who are in need in all sorts of ways, thereby helping to prevent crime happening in the first place. Both in terms of charitable work, education, thinking about our Catholic schools, for instance, and the work that's done in those vis-a-vis attitudes to crime, dangers of crime, all the rest of it. So I think there's that side of the picture, and then there's post-sentence. And I think there is much more that parishes can be doing than is being done at present. Julia's nodding like crazy there, I see. There is a thing called the Welcome Directory, which is a kind of a list of parishes ready to welcome those leaving their sentence. Certainly from the Catholic angle at the moment, there are relatively few parishes signed up to the Welcome Directory across the country. And it's something that we'd like to see grow and develop, but some work needs to be done, I think, before that can really take off. But that's something that I'm looking at myself with my Liaison Bishop for Prisons hat on. There are a number of initiatives around involve getting people into work post-prison, and a number of those are run by church organizations. I visited a couple myself in recent years and kept contact with them. So there are initiatives out there, but there could be more. Julia.
I was just going to add on the prevention side as well, community centres, doing something for young people, especially in areas where they're likely to be vulnerable, to end up in a gang or in crime. I think I read somewhere recently about what happened to our community centres, and that also having a proportion of there being an increase in crime as well. I was also going to add to the Welcome Directory, which is like a list of all faith organizations or places of worship that chaplains get, so that they can send it, that if someone's leaving their prison, they can send them to somewhere close to by that's going to be welcoming to them. And I am for us, and I think this kind of answers your next questions. I don't know if you want me to preempt it, which is how can I volunteer for PACT? We're always looking for parish reps or Faith in Action volunteers. So specifically in your parish, being a contact between PACT and your parish in order to kind of build on that relationship as well. So that's definitely something that can help with parishes.
Thank you. There's a couple of comments have come up here about Imago Dei in Kent opening Grace House, accommodation support for women specifically leaving prison. They have a charity shop as well. The observation is made there. So that's good news to hear about that. So it might be helpful actually for NBCW if perhaps after this event this evening, Emily and Julia, if you could forward into NBCW, build up a little bit of a list of what is available for information. That would be helpful, and then people can or signpost people to where that information is available, so that people can have access to it. I think that's covered everything question-wise. I'm also conscious that we've got 5 minutes left.
Yes, that would be lovely, Emily and Julia, if you can do that, and we can actually circulate it to all the people. Just to say that lots of people have registered, but not all of them are here. But we do intend to send recordings to those people, even though they haven't actually attended now.
Rose, thank you very much. So as we come to the end of our evening, can I thank everybody for joining in this event? It's been helpful and informative, and I'm sure introduced a lot of people to information they didn't have before, opened a lot of eyes to the situation for women across our prisons estate and those in the justice system. So thank you so much for all that's gone into this evening.
Yes.
Just as we finish now, can I turn to Patricia, wherever you've gone to, who I think would like to say a few words? There you are.
Yes. Yes, I'm delighted to be able to say a few words of thanks to our speakers. I think Emily in particular gave us a lot of data, and it's really important to have good data. Any sort of advocacy depends on being able to make your case and make it strong, and indicate that you know what you're talking about. So thank you, Emily, for that in particular, because clearly there is scope for advocacy on this. One of the things which I got from this is that so often there are known areas of good practice which are actually cheaper than sending someone to prison. But nonetheless, those areas of good practice seem to be losing funding, and more money is being spent on prisons, and it doesn't make any sense. I thought, especially also from Emily's report, the importance of pre-sentencing reports. Again, one of those areas where good practice would be to have good pre-sentencing reports based on individual needs and respecting the person. And that should and could reduce the number of people going to prison, and overall make the whole system much more effective and integrated and make it cost less. So there is a question, how can we put pressure on government to look sensibly at good practice and invest in good practice? Women's centres, again, were another area of that. And I'm very, very grateful to Emily for all of that. And for Julia, I'm very grateful for what you were able to tell us, particularly on working with families, the bridging the gap notion, keeping people in touch with their families while they're in prison, supporting them to stay in touch with their families. And I think, because I've come across it before, the prison-based social workers, I think, is a really important initiative. And again, it's one of those areas where you think, we know this works, why don't we invest in it? And yet we don't. Prevention, working with people in prison, and also working with people after they've come out of prison to help them stay out of prison. The whole area of restorative justice, and dealing with the whole person, whether the person is an offender or a victim, is really, really, I think, at the heart of good practice on this. But and there was the other thing that I was left with is this idea. So often we have narratives about, if you've done the crime, you've got to do the time, being tough on being tough on crime always boils down to being tough on people. Those people may be very damaged people suffering from mental health problems, people with difficult family situations, victims of violence. So you've got to look all the time behind the slogans and try and shift the narrative away from the slogan towards the human person, the individual, this woman, these children, this family. So thank you both very much indeed for sharing with us. It's been a real privilege to listen to you and to learn from you this evening. And thank you to Bishop Moth for chairing us and steering us so skillfully through the programme to arrive at 2030 precisely, according to my system. And I'd also like to say, just in passing, thank you to Rose, who has worked really hard to make this evening happen. It's been an excellent evening, and I'm just really so grateful to all of you. Thank you very much.
I would also like to thank Jordan for all the good work she did in getting all these forms up and registrations for people. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has joined in here, who has participated actively in the small groups, and especially to the three of you, Bishop Moth, Emily, and Julia. Thank you so very much.
Rose, thank you. So if I could just give a little plug. Julia's put information up there as to how you can volunteer for PACT. So have a think about that. Thank you to Emily and to all of you involved in the Prison Reform Trust for the work that you do, because it's really important, as we've heard, very, very well researched. So to everybody on the call, perhaps on the back of our time this evening, to think about ways you can reach out to support those going through our criminal justice system. If you're unable to do that, we can always pray for all those who are involved in this, whether that be our prison officers, those going through their sentence, those working in our courts, our police, the victims of crime. And I'd like to put in a particular request in that regard for our young people who are so very often the hidden victims of crime, bullied in school, frightened to speak, having to live with stories that they concoct, mummy's away working and all that sort of thing. So please remember them very particularly in your prayers. So thank you all for joining in this evening, and thank you to the National Board of Catholic Women for this initiative. Where we all gathered together, I would say safe home, but I'm presuming that's where you are. So thank you so much for joining with us, and a blessing to each and every one of you. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye now.